Meshech Chochmah for Parshas Re'eh, and we'll begin in Mirz Hashem, Perik Yud Gimel of Sefer Dvarim, Pasuk Vav. Hanavi hahu o cholem hachalom hahu yumas. A prophet or a dreamer of a dream shall be put to death. Who is that prophet? The Torah says, Ki diber sara al Hashem Elokeichem, because he spoke falsehood about the Lord your God, etc. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us exactly how we put him to death. There are four different categories of Misas Bezdin. Which one applies to this Navi Sheker? It only says that Ubiarta hara mikirbecha. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin, quoted here by Reb Meir Simcha, on Daf Pei Tesam Beis, quotes a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon, who holds that he will be put to death bechenek, as opposed to the Rabbanon, who claim that he should be put to death with skila. And Reb Meir Simcha is bothered by a chapter in Malachim Aleph, chapter 18, which tells or records of a story of Eliyahu Navi, who puts to death Nevi'ei Habal. And they were, of course, Nevi'im, who would be a perfect match for this category described by the verse that we just read. And the Tanakh records that the method of Misa, which Eliyahu Navi employed in the case of the Nevi Abal, was none other than Sayif. And the question is, it doesn't fit into any category. It's not Rabbi Shimon who has Chenek. It's not the Rabban who have Skila. And how could Eliyahu do such a thing? Why did he put them to death with Sayif? V'Eliyahu matzanu sheshachad es Nevi Abal. The pasuk describes Vayiridam Eliyahu el Nachal Kishon Vayishachatem Sham, and the word Vayishachatem is a reference to Sayif, to Cherev. Tzarich Lomar, Reb Meir Simcha offers the following answer: that in addition to their Chiyuv Misa as a Navi Sheker, they had another Chiyuv Misa, Midin Malchus Haraga. In other words, they were part of a rebellion against Achav, the king, who was married to Zevel. They were not great saints, but be that as it may, Achav commanded Eliyahu to put these Nevi'ei Abal to death. And mashma shekol asher asa, everything that Eliyahu did to implement the death penalty to these Nevi'ei Abal was done b'shuso, under the auspices of Achav, Shahaya Oz Sham. And the Tanakh describes, I'll read some of the psukim, Vayomer Eliyahu li'Achav, Alei Achol v'shasei, Vayakev Achav, Vayoretz Lufnei Achav. Everything happens in the presence of Achav. Vayishlach Achav v'chol b'nei Yisrael, Vayikvotzes HaNevi'im, and he gathered the Nevi'im together, and they were put to death. So this was all done under the auspices of what we call Din Malchus. Ula Malchus, Lo Nitan Ella Sayif Bilvad. Here's the lumbus of the great scholar Reb Meir Simcha, based on a Tosefta and a Yerushalmi, and he sees this codified in the Ram Hilchos Malachim Perik Gimel, when we have a mored b'malchus, someone who rebels against the king. Yesh lemelech, the Rambam says, rishus lahargo, the king has the license to put him to death. And the Rambam says, the ein lemelech rishus lahargo ela b'sayif bilvad. And the Rambam reiterates this in Hilchos Sanhedrin. So in two places, Hilchos Malachim and Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Rambam establishes that a mored b'malchus when put to death by the kingship, will only be put to death with sayif. And now, for the second half of this presentation, Rabbi Simcha addresses the question of whether the propriety of Elio to put these Nevi'im to death by Saif was actually the right choice. The Pasuk says, and again, we're in Malachim Aleph, but now we're fast forwarding to chapter 19. Vayagid achav li zevel es kol asher asa liyo v'es kol asher harag es kol hanaviyim b'charet. Now, who's boss? He or she? Right? Men like to say, I'm the boss in this house, and my wife gives me permission to say so. In fact, the one who actually controlled the Malchus was not Achav, it was Izevel. And therefore, when Achav relates to Izevel that Eliyahu Hanavi had put the Nevi'ei Habal to death with Sayif, with Cherev, Oz Rasa, she understood that if, again, this is all Rebbe Simcha's creation in his mind, this is reading between the lines, the storylines in Tanakh, that she, Izevel, understood that Eliyahu applied the principle of Morid B'Malchus. Because otherwise, if he was slaughtering, in this case, the Nevi Abal under the halacha of Navi Sheker, then he would have employed either Skila, according to Reb Shimon, or alternatively, Chenek. Chenek according to Reb Shimon, and Skila according to Tanakama. Why did Eliyahu put them to death with Sayef, with Cheret? There's only one logical possibility to justify that, and she understood this. He's a shtickle Talmud Chacham, I guess, besides being a Rosh Marusha, and she understood that he employed and activated the principle of Morid B'Malchus. But it was Biladei Rishusah. She was not involved in this decision. She was the one who was in control and dominion as the queen. The pasuk says she got very angry. She sends a messenger to Eliyahu, Lamar, to tell him, you're going to suffer the same death. I will take your soul like you took the souls of the Nevi'ah Baal. Okay, does that mean that Eliyahu messed up? I mean, just because Zevel made that statement. Well, guess what? The Medrash in Koheles, Korei al zeh sichlus ma'at. The action of Eliyahu was described by the Medrash itself in Koheles as sichlus. Sichlus literally means idiosyncrasy. This was a stupidity on the part of Eliyahu. Ma'at. Okay, ma'at. Shum shahaya shalo al pidas haTorah. What Eliyahu did was not in compliance with the halacha, a radical statement of the Meshech Chochmah. And he wouldn't have said it on his own if he wasn't standing on the shoulders of a Medrash in Koheles. The Medrash says that midin Torah, according to the Torah law, Eliyahu should have put the Nevi'ah Baal to death, b'skila, b'chenek. V'mahu asa midin malchus, and that which he put him to death with sayif, with cherev, based on morid b'malchus, harei malchus hoisa b'dei izevel v'lo acha. Behilo eskima lekach sheteyasa. So that there's no way that Elio's actions could be justified under the halacha of Mored v'Malchus, because the Malchus was in the hands of Izebel, and she never gave her agreement to put the Nevi'ah Baal to death. And therefore, had Elio done according to Das Torah, he would have put them to death either with skila or alternatively with chenek, but not with chayil. What's fascinating about this presentation is that the entire presentation from beginning to end is a creation of the mind of the Meshech Chochmah, interpreting both a parsha of Elio as well as a sugya in Sanhedrin with two Ramams, a Tosefta Yerushalmi, plus the response of Izebel, and culminating with a medrash in Koheleth. It's just amazing in what the man has at his fingertips and how he draws this all together. We will now fast forward to Pasuk Yud Zayin in the same chapter. Now you may ask me, why am I starting this year with Perek Yud Gimel? The answer is, I'm trying not to repeat myself, so I'm sure you all remember what I said a year ago. I blinked, nobody saw my, anyway. So therefore I'm starting in the middle of this Parshas Re'eh. So let's open up the Chumash to Pasuk Yud Zayin. The Pasuk is addressing the famous Ir Hanidachas. And the Torah says at the end of Pasuk Yud Zayin, we don't have to go through all the psukim here, we have a time constraint. V'haisa tel olam, after we destroy the entire city, we burn the entire city, lo tibane od. And Reb Meir Simcha is very sensitive to the extra word od. It seems to be redundant. Even if you would omit the word od and you only add lo tibane, it would imply that we don't rebuild the city. Is it possible that the word od is now what we call a miut? Miut means when you have an extra word and it comes to exclude, it's an exclusion. And in that case, it gives us a hint to a leniency that maybe we could rebuild the city or build something in that location, if not the city itself. So let's see how Reb Meir Simcha understands the word od. He quotes a Mishnah at the end of Masechta Sanhedrin, who quotes Rabbi Akiva, Lo tibane od, likemosha haisa, eino nivnes. You cannot rebuild the city od, meaning a duplicate of the original city. But you can use the land. The Torah doesn't say burn the city down and the land is, so to speak, removed from the face of the map. Don't rebuild it as an urban center. What says Rabbi Akiva? Aval naseis ganim upardesim. You can plant gardens, orchards. The land is the land of Israel, and it doesn't have to lie fallow. The ode is telling you, don't redo what and replace what was original. But it's implying that there are other uses and other ways that can use the ground. Says Reb Meir Simcha, diek mi od yisera, the redundant word od, mashma dafka od apam demosha haisa. So the word od, it's a short form for od hapam demosha haisa. And Reb Meir Simcha now, with his erudite scholarship, is going to show you how that word od consistently in other usages without throughout the Torah will mean od hapam k'moshe ha'is. And he quotes the Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin. V'cheinu omer. the Yerushalmi wants to interpret an extra word od with regard to the law of Mitzrayim. We're not allowed to go back to Mitzrayim. And the Torah enjoins us, lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od. Don't go back. You after the Exodus, you left Mitzrayim in a certain derech. Don't retrace your steps and go back to Mitzrayim. What the Torah says, says the Yerushalmi, liyeshiva eina tachozer, aval tachozer lischora uleprakmatya v'lichbo sha'aretz. By using the word od, and again, this is Rameir Simcha's take on the Yerushalmi, the Torah is telling me, don't go back to Mitzrayim in the same way that you entered in Mitzrayim and you lived in Mitzrayim. The Jewish people dwelled in Mitzrayim for 2 centuries, almost. That's a permanent settlement in Mitzrayim. But the Yerushalmi is permissible with regard to going to do business in Egypt, which is called prakmatya or schora. And even if it means to conquer part of the land of Mitzrayim, but not for the purpose of dwelling, but within a context of some sort of military confrontation, that's permissible. Why? Because the Torah added the word od. Od apam k'moshe haisa. It should not be a yeshiva like the yeshiva of Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim for that long period of time. At the end of this presentation, he quotes the Pnei Moshe. The Pnei Moshe is one of the 2 super commentaries on the Yerushalmi. And the Pnei Moshe, he says, has a different take on what the Yerushalmi understood and how it derived the heter to allow us to go back for business purposes to Mitzrayim. And the Pnei Moshe puts the emphasis on the word lashu, not on the word od. According to Pnei Moshe's interpretation of the Yerushalmi was not deriving this kula, this leniency from the word od, but rather from the word lashu. And the word lashu means to go back to yeshiva kvua, to dwell in a permanent way in Egypt. However, Rameir Simcha, without fighting against the Pnei Moshe, he adds v'tireh ha'emes. He says, you should see the truth, meaning the Pnei Moshe is, he's not on target in this case. He's off base. Because this word od consistently means od k'moshe haisa. Another time like it was originally. And he ends by dugmaso matzinu li'el b'sifri b'midbar korach piska kuf yud vav. So Rabbi Simcha doesn't quote the Sifri, he just alludes to the Sifri. However, there is a comment here in the footnote. Just 1 second. It says, V'lo yia od ketzef. And the Sifri says, Ein Talmud lomar od. Why did the Torah have to add the word od? El kfar kotzaf. God already got angry. And the Sifri says that this kind of punishment that was meted out to Korach and his Eidah would not be repeated. The grounds opened up and swallowed up Korach Vadaso. And the Sifri compares it to Veloya Od Mabul, that if God wants to take out his divine wrath on the nations of the world, on the inhabitants of the globe, he will not do it with a mabul that would destroy the entire earth. Od. Od means Oda Pam Kmosha Haisa. Or V'lo Yikruvu Od B'nei Yisrael, V'lo Yizbachu Od Esivcheim. Many, many different examples that the Sifri invokes of the word Od, meaning Oda Pam Kmosha Haisa. Rabbosai, now we're going to start Perek Yud Dalet. Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. The Torah describes the Jewish nation as banim, sons of God. So Meir Simcha raises the following issue. When the Torah describes, or shall we say, classifies the Jewish nation as banim, is that absolute? Is that always the case? Or is it conditional? And Rabbi Simcha quotes a Sifri, which in turn records a machlokes tanoim between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir on this very question. Are the Jewish people always guaranteed that description as banim, and they will always be banim in the eyes of the Almighty? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im noagim atem kibanim, harei atem banim. If you behave as an obedient child and fulfill the will of his parents without deviating, without rebelling, then God says, you are my banim. The imlav, but if you deviate from the will of God, you are no longer banim. Einatem banim. We are not guaranteed, according to Rabbi Yehuda, an absolute status as banim in the eyes of God. It's contingent. And we could forfeit that status. And Rabbi Meir, we'll see in a minute, will disagree. We are always banim. Rabbi Meir Simcha wants to analyze the source of this machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Not in philosophical terms, in terms of hashkafa, but in terms of the rules and regulations that apply to interpreting and commenting on the Torah. Says Rabbi Simcha, brilliant move here, quoting a Gemara in Yevamis out of his hat. The Gemara in Yevamis mentioned a sheet of Tanoim that ein darshin smuchin. We do not derive conclusions from the contiguity of two psukim, even if two psukim are juxtaposed, one next to the other. That doesn't give us a right to interpret and conclude smuchin. However, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yehuda subscribes to that shita of ein darshim smukim, with the exception of Sefer Dvarim. And in the book of, as we call Deuteronomy, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda will claim that we do darshan smuchim. And the Gemara goes into a whole discussion, because when Moshe Rabbeinu presented Sefer Dvarim to the Jewish people, he was very, very careful about the juxtaposition of psukim. So Rabbi Yehuda holds, even though in the first 4 books of Moses, ain't darshan smuchim, but nevertheless in the 5th book of Deuteronomy, we are darish smuchim. This is a Gemara in Meshech Yevamis on Daf Dal. And Rabbi Simcha sees in that Gemara the key to unlock the mystery of this Sifri here in Parshas Re'eh on the pasuk Banim Atem L'Hashem Elokeichem, as to why Rabbi Yehuda in the Sifri opines that im ein atem osim ritzono shel makom, the deal is off, you're not born. Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, because since we're dealing with Sefer Dvarim, otherwise known as Mishnah Torah, Rabbi Yehuda agrees and he consents that here we will darshan smuchim. So Rabbosa, if you have your Chumash open, take a look at the very last pasuk in chapter Yud Gimel. Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha lishmar es kol mitzvosav Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom la'asos hayashar b'nei Hashem Elokecha. Bonim atem l'Hashem Elokecha. The introduction to Bonim is ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha. Lishmar is kol mitzvosa. Says Rabbi Yehuda in Sefer Dvarim Mishnah Torah, I agree that we derive conclusions from the juxtaposition from Smichus. And the Torah puts these two psukim together. One at the end of Perek Yud Gimel, the other at the beginning of Perek Yud Daled, to teach us that for Haya im Tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha, then Banim atem l'Hashem Elokecha. But only then it's conditional and it's contingent. Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, holds that ain't darshan smuchin. Period. There's no exception to that rule. And Sefer Dvarim is no different than the other four books. So to explain Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir Simcha says, "V'hachi darish." This is the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda. And again, it might not appear in the Sifri, but it appears in the mind, the creative mind of Rabbi Meir Simcha. Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha la'asos hayashar b'nei Hashem banim atem. Then you are banim. Reb Meir Omer ben kach uben kach banim atem l'Hashem Elokecha. We are absolutely guaranteed the status of banim. And I'll prove it to you. And he quotes a pasuk in Hosea Navi, which l'chora has no proof whatsoever that we're always called banim. But Rabbi Meir Simcha is going to analyze the proof from Hosea of Rabbi Meir. Vayam mispar b'nei Yisrael kechol hayam, and the numbers of Israel are massive, myriads, like the grains of sand on the beach. Vayam makom asher yomar lehem lo ami atem, yomar lehem b'nei kelcha. B'nei kelcha. Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, what did Rabbi Meir see in this pasuk in Hosea? And the answer is that the Torah elsewhere says that you will not be able to count the people of Israel. But here the pasuk says that you can count them, but their multitudes will be equal to that of the sand. Again, it's very hard to count the grains of sand, but nevertheless they counted them. And therefore, Reb Meir understood that Yisrael ain't osim ritzona shel makom. Then the numbers and the population of the Jewish people are limited, are finite. It can be counted. Kechol hayam. The Omar Shapir Raya, now he brings a very good proof. As Hosea would say, V'hoya mispar. V'hoya mispar means that you can be counted. Why is it that we can count them and the people in this pasuk are described as finite in number? Because they're not doing the will of Hashem. And nevertheless, that very same pasuk, V'hoya mispar, ends with the words Lo ami atem Eliyomar b'ni kel chai. That Lo ami means you're not living up to my expectations, but nevertheless b'ni kel chai, you remain b'ni. Arei dekruyim b'nei kel chai af kishe'ein osim ritzono shalom. Unbelievable. Get chilled. I mean, look what he puts together over here. All this knowledge as a cholent, producing a whole new perspective on the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Where does this machlokas emanate from? Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, we don't darshan smuchim, but Bamidbar Amurim, the first four books of Moses, but in the fifth book of Moses, we darshan smuchim. Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, if you understand that Gemara in Yevamos about Rabbi Yehuda, that he concedes that there is smuchim in Sefer Dvarim, now we come back and we shed a new light on Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda saw the previous pasuk that says, Ki tishma b'kol Hashem Elokecha, that sets up the condition. But Meir, on the other hand, holds that ain't darshan smuchim, period. there is no drush of smuchim in any of the 5 books of Moses, including Sefer Dvarim. And therefore, Rabbi Meir is not going to pay any attention whatsoever to smuchim. But moreover, Rabbi Meir Simcha says that Rabbi Meir had a proof from a pasuk in Oshaya. The pasuk says, "Mispar, v'haya mispar b'nei Yisrael." Chazal say, how could it be that we can count b'nei Yisrael when the Torah elsewhere says we cannot count b'nei Yisrael? How can you justify v'haya mispar? The answer is v'haya mispar when bisman she'eino sivritzon shel makom. But the end of the pasuk says, "B'ni kel chai." Nevertheless, God considers us as one. I saw in the notes that he says we have a general rule that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Meir, which is pretty depressing in this context because it means that based on the smichus, we are not necessarily bonim to Hashem. But he says in this case, we no doubt paskin like Rabbi Meir because we hold that lo darshina and smuchin even in Sefer Dvarim. So in this case, because of the what's the word I want to use? The general consensus of the Tanoim that Sefer Dvarim is not an exception to the rule, and we don't dash in smuchin, then we have to accept the sheet of Rabbi Meir. And in this exceptional case, we're going to paskin like Rabbi Meir because he has the whole, the whole entourage of Tanoim behind him against Rabbi Yehuda because we're not going to dash in smuchin, and we have the proof to support Rabbi Meir from the pasuk in Hoshea. So that's good news at the end of the day. We now move forward in Perek Yudalid. One second. And we're going to take a look at Pasuk Chav Gimel. V'achalto lifnei Hashem Elokecha b'mokum asher yivkar l'shaken shmo sham Maaseh degoncha tiroshcha v'yitzrecha b'choros b'karcha b'tzonecha leman tilmad lira es Hashem Elokecha kol hayom. So Rabbi Simcha quotes a Chazal in the Gemara in Perek Ha'isha Rabbah and Yevamos. What does it mean, Leman Tilmad Kol Hayomim? What are these Yomim? Undefined. Elu Shabbosos v'Yomim Tov. So Rabbi Simcha wants to understand what is this Yira, the fear of God, on Shabbos and Yom Tov. I mean, Yira is something that applies the whole week long. And he quotes a Sugyan Baba Basra, which he claims holds the key to unlock this mystery about the Gemara of Elu Shabbosos v'Yom Tov with regard to Yira. The Gemara says, Shama aser mevi meiser mevi lideyir. That perhaps this is a metaphysical statement on the part of Chazal, but somehow Maser, giving 1/10, in this case to the Levi, or separating 1/10 on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the cycle of Shemitah, and bringing that 10th of his produce up to Yerushalayim, Ma'aser Sheni. This will bring Yira. Why? And Rabbi Simcha focuses our attention on Ma'aser Sheni. And the reason for that is because the Torah here says, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. And that refers specifically to Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Rishon, I can give to the Levi Midan Ve'ad Beersheba and below Beersheba. But when it comes to Ma'aser Sheni, I have to bring it up to Yerushalayim or whatever, Pijon. So this pasuk is referring specifically to Ma'aser Sheni, and it's brought to Yerushalayim. What happens in Yerushalayim? Obviously, he brings the Maser, and he has to eat the Maser b'kedusha in Yerushalayim. But what else happens? Uroa shekulam oskim b'melechet shamayim ubavod. Yerushalayim is a city that is inhabited by, if I can use an idiomatic phrase, and I don't mean it pejoratively, by holy rollers. You know, when I was growing up, they used to say about Yerushalayim that if you throw a stone in Yerushalayim, there's a 50% chance that you'll hit a Rosh Hashiva. Yerushalayim is the city of holy rollers, the pious people. Rabbi Simcha describes them as oskim b'meleches shamayim uba'avoda. The Kohanim, the Leviim, they're involved in avoda. That's the city of Yerushalayim. So you might think that a Jew, a farmer, he brings his produce from who knows where, all the way up north, in the Galil, and he brings it to Yerushalayim, he will be elevated and inspired by the environment of Yerushalayim. Is that not so? He looks around, look at all these frum people, you know, very frum people, ultra-Orthodox. But that's not going to happen. Why? Because Lo Yikaba, he's not going to be inspired because he sees himself as Tarud b'malachto lahavi teref lebeis. He, in a sense, I don't know, and I'm afraid to use this word, but he's a little bit alienated, so to speak. I don't mean in a pejorative sense, but you know, how could I be inspired by the Jerusalemites when I am so preoccupied and so nervous, full of anxiety? You know, if I could add a footnote of my own here, he's eking out a living. So it's very wonderful that these people in Yerushalayim, who are being supported by Trumos and Maestros, and they're busy, dedicated exclusively to the Avoda, they're on a high level of Yira. But it's hard for me to be inspired by their Yira because I see myself as a soul that is dedicated to work and toil and eke out a living, to support my family. Omnam, this is the Chiddush, the psychological insight of Rameir Simcha. The Shabbos v'Yontiv, all of a sudden, there's a transformation of personality. On Shabbos and Yontiv, he's not involved in Malacha. On the contrary, he is uplifted by a Neshama Yisera. He, like the Kohanim, is totally dedicated to the service of Hashem. And there he is, surrounded in Yerushalayim by those who are dedicated to Yira, to the fear of Hashem. Us, then he's inspired. Yilmad me'akonim lasot b'Torah u'ba'avodas Hashem. And now he takes advantage of a Shabbos and of a Yontif to dedicate his time to the service of Hashem, b'Torah u'b'tfilah, and he imitates and is inspired by the Kohen. Once again, pure original creation of the mind of Rameir Simcha. And here we fast forward to Perek Tezvav. Let's take a look at Pasuk Yud Dalet. We're talking about what's called an Eved Ivri, who is sold, a Jewish individual is sold into servitude for a period of 6 years. And the Torah says in Pasuk Yud Beis, Ub'Shana Shvi'is, Tishalchenu Chavshi Meimach, and you set him free in the 7th year. I mean, the exception to that rule, as you know, in Parshas Mishpatim, is the Eved Nirtza who refuses to go free. But that's not our discussion. We're talking about an Eved. He's going free on the 7th year. The Torah requires that he be freed on the 7th year. The Torah says, "V'chisa shalchenu chavshi," when you free him from his servitude, lo tishalchenu reikam, don't send him out empty-handed, but rather hanik tanik lo. I'll read to you the translation. You shall surely provide for him mitzoncha, migarcha, mikvecha, from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your vat. Asher beirachecha Hashem Elokecha titein lo. Give him from that which the Lord your God has blessed you with. We have here a new mitzvah called Hanek Tanek. When you free your Eved, you have to give him a gift, and that gift is a reflection of the bracha, the blessing that God, through his emanations, has bestowed upon you. So you're, so to speak, a well-to-do person. You have your own servants. You have the Eved Ivri. You send him free on the 7th year. But Hanek Tanek Lo, you must provide him with a gift, because that reflects the great blessing that God has bestowed. And Rameir Simcha quotes the Sifri. It says in the pasuk, Hanek Tanek Lo. Do you see that word lo? The word lo is redundant. You don't need the word lo to him, because after all, who else are you giving this gift to? It says, Shalchenu Chavshi, lo tishalchenu reikam. Hanek Tanek. So why do you need the word lo? Says the Sifri, v'lo liyarsha. It means that before the master who freed his slave, his servant, got a chance, the opportunity to be Mekayim, the midst of Hanek Tanek, the slave died. And now his Yarshin, his heirs, are coming to collect the Hanokah. Torah says no. Lo, v'lo liyarshin. There is no obligation for the master who frees his slave to transfer from his bank account, from his flock, any gift to the Yarshin. Lo, only to the Eved. Yain Girsas Hagrab Hagosav al Shas. The Gaon wrote a glossary, glosses on the Shas here in Meshech Kiddushin, and take a look at his corrections. Very often the Gaon corrects errors that crept into the printed version of the Talmud. Udvarav divrei even chen lemevin shvuas hasugi. If you learn the sugya properly, you will see absolutely how the Gaon is avnei chen. He's describing it, Rameir Simcha, as cherished jewels, words of jewels of the Gaon. Because those who upheld the girsa that we have against the Gaon, they removed this drasha of lo v'lo liyarsha. They had a different drasha in their gears of lo v'lo lebal chova, which means ein ha'adon mechuyav lahagbos hanoko lebal chova shel ha'eved. If the eved owes a debt, he has an outstanding loan, then the master, when he frees the eved, he's not obligated to pay up that chov. And that's derived from the pasuk lo. Says Rameir Simcha, but the Gaon's gear says absolutely justified. And lo is coming to exclude Yarshin. How so? Trey lo ksiven. The pasuk lo appears twice. Let's open up the Chumash once again. It says in pasuk Yudalit, towards the beginning of the pasuk, hanek hanek lo, and at the end of the pasuk, it says titain lo. Both drushos, therefore, are correct. One lo is to exclude yarshim, and if the Eved, in event the Eved died before the Hanukah was transferred into his bank account, then the master is off the hook. He will not have to capitulate to the claim of the yarshim. And the other lo is coming to exclude a balcho. And therefore the Gaon is absolutely justified in accepting and correcting the girsa that lo v'lo liyarshav, which we saw also in the Sifri. So there's no contradiction between the drasha of lo v'lo l'malchov in the Gemara in Kedushin Tesvav and the Sifri that darshans lo v'lo liyarshav, which is a halach that's upheld, the drasha that's upheld by the Gaon, because in fact there are two lo's, and the word lo appears twice. Says Reb Meir Simcha, Ein ma'anikim liyarshav. Why is it that there's no obligation to transfer the Hanukah to the yarshim of the Eved in event that the Eved died? Rak lo li'atzmo. The Torah says lo to the Eved you give a Hanukah. Why? B'chasa rachmana al nafsho shel Eved. Aval im nisbarech habayis biglalo, oz shapir shayach liyarshav, tehavi kamo schar pa'ula. Unbelievable. The Meshech wants to justify the two drashos of lo, the lo at the beginning of this pasuk and the lo at the end of this pasuk. On the one hand, the lo at the beginning of the pasuk excludes the yarshim. They cannot demand payment of hanukah. On the other hand, the lo at the end of the pasuk is not going to exclude yarshim. It's going to exclude, as we said before, the Gemara in Kedushin derives balchol, implying that there are situations in which the yarshim have a right to collect hanukah, because the second lo does not exclude yarshim. And as far as the second lo is concerned, excluding a balchov, it includes yarshim. How could that be possible? That on the one hand, you're telling me the yarshim have no right to hanukah, it's lo liatzmo to the Eved, because chasa rachmana al nafshel shel Eved. On the other hand, at the end of the pasuk, the word lo includes even the yarshim, and it only excludes balchov, and the yarshim have a right to collect hanukah. How is that so? Says Reb Meir Simcha, because we have to read carefully the second lo at the end of this pasuk. Asher beirachacha Hashem Elokecha Titain lo. There are two scenarios. What happened to the total assets of the master during the period, the interval of 6 years, when this Eved was in his employment? When the Eved terminates his employment at the end of 6 years, and we look at the bank account of the master, what is the bottom line that we see in the master's bank account? Is it identical to what was his bank account at the beginning of the 6-year period? If that be the case, then the Yarshim have no claim to any monetary compensation for any extra bracha that their relative, who now passed away, the Eved, brought to the Adon. But if the bottom line, the bottom number, is that much greater, and there's been an increase in the tzon and the goren and the yekev as a result of this Eved, then we see that God bestowed a blessing on the possessions and the wealth of the Adon as a result of this Eved. Says Rameir Simcha, in such a case, the money is not some sort of act, it's not some sort of act of stock and chesed, but rather it's a payment of schar pa'ula. And the law is that if an eved works for an adon and he hasn't been paid for his wages have not been paid, then the Yarshim have a right to claim those wages. To summarize, Rameir Simcha sees in the mitzvah of Hanukkah two distinct dimensions. One dimension is chesed and staka. The Eved Nebuch is now going out on his own. He doesn't have another job. Let's give him staka. He's no worse than an ani. On the contrary, you should have special feelings as the master and gratitude to the Eved. Feel compassion for him and grant him Hanukkah. There's another dimension of Hanukkah, and that is to pay the Eved Schar Pu'ula for monies that you have gained, Mr. Master, as a result of this Eved. And then Afkamin is whether the Yarshim have a right to claim, in the event of the death of their relative of the Eved, claim Hanukkah. If it's Chesed and Staka, then the master's heart goes out for the Eved. Unfortunately, he's dead. There's no claim to the Yarshim. But if, on the other hand, the bracha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestowed upon the master was a result of this Eved brought in the bracha, then he deserves to be paid. That's called schar pa'ula. Those are wages, monetary obligations, and compensation. In that case, the law is that the Yarshim have a right to collect that compensation. Incredible creative insight of the Meshech. And now we look in Perek Tes Zayin, which is the final chapter of Parshas Re'eh, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm making a mistake. Yeah, Tes Zayin. Pasuk Ches. This is the Parsha of the Moadim, and it begins with Chag Pesach, Shomer es Chodesh Ha'av. And the Torah enjoins us from eating chametz and requires that we eat matzah. Shivas Yomim Tochal of Matzos Lechem Oni. We're all familiar with these psukim. Then, fast forward to Pasuk Ches. Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos. Ubeyom Hashvi Atzeres Lashem Elokechem Lo Tasim Malach. Well, what's exactly going on over here? We eat matzah for 7 days. But what's Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos? The end of the pasuk makes sense that Yom HaShvi, the 7th day of Pesach, is endowed with Kedushas Hayom that generates an Iser Malach. But what's the Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos? So Kedarko Bakodesh, Rameir Simcha quotes the Sifri, and the Sifri says, Min HaChodesh. So let's understand, on the 2nd day of Pesach, the 16th of Nisan, which carbon is brought? You all got it right? The Omer, even though I didn't hear a word, but as a result of the carbon of Omer, all of Chadash becomes Yashan, which means that if you have matzah that was made from this year's crops, which is Chadash, you would be allowed to eat those matzos because they turn into Yashan for the balance of Chag Pesach, namely for the last 6 days of the Chag. Says Rameir Simcha, Pirish Ta'akra Mashmiya Lanu She'eno Tzorch Lahamtin Ad She'akrivu Omer Shechazoka She'ein Bezdin Shel Kohanim Is Atzlim L'Akriva. You live in Dan or Beersheba. You didn't hear. You don't know. There was no social media to check, Facebook and find out that they brought the Omer. How do you know if they brought the Omer? So the Torah says, go ahead and rely on the Bezdin that supervises the Akravas HaOmer and the Migdash. You can rely on the fact that Kederech Halacha, they fulfilled the obligation and they brought the Karban Omer in its proper time on the 16th of Nisan. And now you can eat from the 16th for the balance of Pesach, the other 6 days, eat your matzah that's made of chadash. It's yashim. And Rabbi Simcha says that this is a fulfillment of the principle of shliach, chazaka shliach osa shlichus. So that's number one. That the Torah is teaching me that wherever you are on the face of the map of Israel, you can eat your matzahs chadash for 6 days, and you could assume without any hesitation that the Omer was brought in its time. Chazaka, the Bezdin are Zrizim, and Shliach Osa Shlichus. Adkan Hatkofa Al. Now, if you will, fast forward to the next entry of Reb Meir Simcha, also on the same pasuk. Again, if you add the edition that I have, it's on page Kuf Vav. Reb Meir Simcha has a diuk in the pasuk. Whenever the Torah speaks about the prohibition of doing malach on Yantiv, there's always an extra word in the pasuk, with this exception that we're seeing here. It always says, Kol maleches avoda lo sas. Here it says, Lo tasem malach, referring to the last day of Chag HaPesach. So Meir Simcha is bothered by this. Why is the word avoda omitted here? And it has great significance. When the Torah adds the word avoda, it indicates that the package of 39 malachos is subdivided into 2 categories. There's maleches avoda, and then there's maleches ochel nefesh, that's done for the purpose of food. So the Torah always adds a description of the Isur Malacha with regard to Yantif, maleches avoda, implying that maleches ochel nefesh is mutter. But here, in this context, the Torah somehow dropped the ball and omitted the word avoda. V'lo maleches avoda. Says Reb Meir Simcha, the only way of justifying the absence of the word, the omission of the word avoda, is that Yom HaShvi chal b'Shabbos. The 7th day of Pesach was coincided with Shabbos, and therefore all malacha is prohibited in this particular case, because the 7th day of Pesach is also, in addition to being Yontif, it's also Shabbos. There's no heter meleches ochel nefesh. All malacha is prohibited. So what's the significance here of the 7th day falling out on Shabbos? Now, if the 7th day fell on Shabbos, when was the first day of Pesach? Sunday. Did everybody say Sunday? I didn't hear you. Okay. What's the significance of telling me that the first day of Pesach was on a Sunday and the last day on Shabbos? My high. This is Rabbi Simcha. Brilliantly. The Torah is coming lafuke to exclude the tzdukim. The tzdukim were of the opinion that the Omer should be brought mimachras haShabbos, the day after Shabbos. Every single Pesach, according to the tzdukim, the Omer is brought on a Sunday. This pasuk is going to discredit and reject the tzdukim. And now the Torah is telling you that even when Pesach falls out on a Sunday, Sheishes Yomim Tochal Min HaChodosh, the Sifri says, you could have 6 days of eating matzah min HaChodosh from Sunday till Shabbos. But L'divrei Atzdukim, Hayetzorach Lios Mimachras HaShabbos Shel HaRegel, Kol Yimei HaPesach Asur B'Achilas Matzah Michadash. According to the calculation of Mimachras HaShabbos of the Tzdukim, their interpretation, then all the days of Pesach would be Asur B'Achilas Matzah in this case. Lazeh Omar Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos Min HaChodesh.